Hey everyone, let's talk about chapter 12 of No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brodie, Master of Languages. Let's get right into it. This chapter talks a lot about Joseph Smith's emphasis on personal growth and education. He's arrived at a position of power and privilege. He's escaped the throes of death and humiliation in Zion's camp, and what else should you do in a moment after that but learn Hebrew, I guess. I have a really hard time with this the discourse on Mormon intellectualism because of my history, my narrative. I'm college educated, my wife is college educated, my parents have 3 degrees between them. I have extended family that are doctors and have graduate degrees and things like that. So I grew up in a family that really put a high priority on being educated, and I grew up hearing Gordon B. Hinckley talk about the importance for Latter-day Saints to educate them in all things, not only the things of the gospel, but also the things of the world, so that we can be better citizens and so that we can understand each other better. And I think that's a great message. That's one of the great strengths of Mormonism on paper. On paper, Mormonism is very accommodating and is perhaps of all the Christian sects in the modern world is the most encouraging of people to get a quality education. Again, I can't stress enough, on paper. The second you learn anything that goes against the prophets of the Latter-day Saint Church, it suddenly becomes the wisdom of men, which will crumble in the last days. And so you've got this dichotomy between the scriptures praising Joseph Smith and people like him for, the humble or the true wise ones, and Second Nephi talks in the Book of Mormon talks about woe unto the wicked, for when they are learned they think they are wise. One of the big things that they talk about in the temple, and I should say now for anyone listening, I'm going to be talking about some of the details that occur inside of the endowment session of the Mormon temple ceremony. If that's something that is perch your ears up, just be aware I'm going to be talking about that. I think most people listening are probably people who won't mind me divulging that, but it is a matter of covenant breaking for some, so there's your heads up. And with that, I forgot what I was even going to say, but just know that we're going to be talking about the temple. I remember now, we were talking about how one of the major themes and threads throughout the narrative of the endowment ceremony is this idea that there are the philosophies of men mingled with Scripture. In the Garden of Eden, there is nothing except the word of the Lord, but also apparently they let Lucifer into the Garden of Eden. When you go on your mission and you start studying the plan of salvation, it doesn't make any sense, and it's one of those things where it's kind of like the doctrine of the Trinity, where even the people that have college degrees in theology can't even really totally explain it. The common saying goes, if you can't explain it simply to a child, then it's not worth explaining, or you're not capable of teaching it. And I think there are some things. Again, the apologetic response is, well, how great are Jacob chapter 4? How great are the mysteries in the grandeur of God, and we could never comprehend His ways and His magnificence, etc. That's very convenient that we don't get to know the creator of the universe at more than what the prophets tell us during General Conference, which is not very much, as it turns out. So I hate this idea of Boyd K. Packer telling I think it was the 1990s, where they said that the enemies of the church included feminists, homosexuals, and intellectuals. What an interesting motley crew of people to consider your mortal enemies to your church. You would think that the enemies to the LDS church ought to be poverty and homelessness and sickness and loneliness and things like that, but no, it's feminists and intellectuals. So I take issue with that. Being humble is good, getting an education is good, but the second that you have the philosophies of men mingled with Scripture, oh, you have been consumed by the fiery darts of the adversary. I hate that. I think it's BS, to be honest with you. Again, we've talked a lot about status in the last few of these commentaries, and this is a thing. It says that Joseph at heart had always been tremendously impressed by book learning. This is a status for Joseph. He grew up in an impoverished farming community in rural New York. These people, and this is a time where books were exorbitantly expensive. Barnes and Noble, like, they would not have believed their eyes if they could see that you could have a Kindle and like ebooks and public domain, even just the books that you can get at the library, outnumber anything in their wildest dreams. And so to be learned, to be like Charles Anthon at Columbia University. Joseph Smith visits New York City. We talked about that letter he wrote to Emma Smith when he was in New York. He's seeing people that are book smart, and he wants what he can't have, and now he can have it, apparently. I think the opposite of that is cottagecore, which is the movement of people like doing the exact opposite, like quitting their corporate city urban jobs and like succumbing to the aesthetic of like the gingham tablecloths and the home churned butter and knitting your own socks and sitting on the rocking chair on your wraparound porch in your antebellum. You know what I'm saying? Like, cottagecore is interesting. I probably conflated like 7 different aesthetics there, but this idea of we see things that other people have that intrigue us and we want it. And Joseph Smith wanted more than anything else to be smart. He knew he was naturally intelligent, because there's a huge difference between intelligence and literacy, right? So Joseph Smith is preternaturally disposed with an enormous amount of intelligence, but his literacy is considerably lagging, and it makes very clear that once he did start hiring tutors to learn Greek and Hebrew and things like that, he was a natural, and he was picking it up right and left. I love it says, Joseph was the calf that sucked 3 cows. He acquired knowledge very rapidly, while Heber C. Kimball never came to understand the difference between noun and verb. Oof, that hurts. That was a good little quip there. This is so crazy. A lot of this chapter talks about Egyptology and the coming forth of the Book of Abraham, of course, which is a really touchy subject in Mormonism, because a lot of people think that one of the easiest cards to fall in the narrative of mainstream Mormon history is the Book of Abraham. It is of all things in the church that have questionable or fishy origins, the world's best apologists really can't get past the origin and the problematic aspects that center around the Book of Abraham as God lives on Kolob, to use that metaphor. I love this. It says, with the whole of Kirtland's male population interested in the study of ancient languages, this is like their fantasy football. Like, these people are absolutely like geeking out. That's pretty cool. Can you imagine their Sunday school, like the elders quorum lessons these guys must have been interested in? Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not interested in that now, but like if there was a school of the prophets happening, sort of a thing, when I was an active member of the church, I would have been the leader of that. I would have been all over it, eating it up. Maybe I'm a prophet, but we keep talking about in the commentaries about how, at least I'm noticing a pattern where Joseph Smith will read. He seems to have read a bunch of stuff, which is cool. I like to read too. he'll read something and then he'll go, oh, okay, I can incorporate that into my theology, into my church policies, into my revelations, etc. Happened with the Book of Mormon in view of the Hebrews. It happened with the health and science journals of the 1830s and the introduction of the Word of Wisdom as a counsel to the saints. And it happens again here with Thomas Dick's Philosophy of a Future State, which is this acid trip metaphysical meditation on the millions of cosmos. Like, think about, I mean, this is pre-Carl Sagan, this is pre- Einstein, relativity. I mean, these people saw a meteor shower and thought it meant that Jesus was coming again. You can only imagine, like, the level of ignorance these people had about the universe around us outside of the atmosphere of Earth. And so Joseph reads this book and is just like, oh my goodness gracious, this is amazing stuff, and I'm going to put this into my theology. And so he gets these papyri, and then boom, the Book of Abraham. We've got Kolob, we've got the intelligences being organized. Again, like verbatim words taken out of these primary documents. This is not speculation on the part of Fawn Brodie. This is very carefully researched and executed in her summary of how Joseph Smith took these inputs, and his output was his own theological ruminations on what he read. That's brilliant. I want to think of the good ending of Joseph Smith. Like, there's like that Marvel TV show called What If, where there's like different scenarios that happen within the Marvel comic, film and TV universe. What if Joseph Smith was the next Martin Luther? Certainly a bunch of mainstream Mormons view him as a Martin Luther reformer type figure, but he's not a reformer, he's a restorer, and he's a prophet. Praise to the man, etc. But can you imagine if Joseph didn't commit decades worth of adultery with maybe 100 or several, definitely dozens of women, if he never did the treasure digging, if he never lied about the revelations, if Zion's camp, all these negative things about Joseph never happened, and all he did was just apply himself with his brilliant preternatural intelligence and thirst for knowledge, this dude could have been a theological genius, bar none. And some people think he is, and that may even be true. I think we need to afford him credit. There are things that Joseph Smith contributed to the discourse of Christianity that no theologian to date has been able to answer. Almost every major question that was being thrown about in American Christian discourse, Joseph Smith had an answer to, much of it being in the Book of Mormon and much of it coming later as he matured and found more wisdom. I loved hearing about him learning Hebrew and writing excitedly in his journal about how amazing it felt for him to read the stories of the Old Testament in the mother tongue. That's awesome. And I just, it's too bad that Mormonism has become what it has, because even as an agnostic atheist, I recognize that there are some really interesting theological considerations. I was kind of making fun of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden as being this super complicated, difficult to explain thing, and it is difficult to understand and justify. But one thing I will say is that the Mormon conception of Eve as being a pioneer, kind of boss bitch, taking matters into her own hands, and I see that this must be and the transgression of Adam and Eve being a part of God's plan. That is, in my opinion, and I served a mission and I was indoctrinated from birth to believe this, but I think it does make a lot of sense, way more than, oh yeah, she ate the apple and therefore misogyny is justified throughout the history of mankind and women are the inferior gender, and all that nonsense, the garbage. I think the Mormon explanation of Adam and Eve makes a lot more sense. I can't even believe I just said that, because The prophet of the Mormon Church, President Nelson, does not believe in evolution, despite being a world-renowned heart surgeon. I'm not even sure if that's true. Has anyone ever fact-checked that? I know that he was a pioneering doctor for heart surgery in the mid 20th century. I also know that he did establish like really important. He would go to China, I think, and taught people of his methods there. He's fluent in Mandarin. All of that very great stuff. But anyway, nonetheless, let's see here. I liked that it talked about how the Book of Abraham was a avenue for Joseph to teach his philosophy through storytelling. I think that's really brilliant. Again, all of this could have, he could have written the Book of Abraham without it containing really horrifically racist ideologies, such as the concept that people who are people of color are the result of being 1/3 of the host of heaven who were kind of fence sitters in the Great War. I also thought it was interesting that it talked about Milton and Paradise Lost, and I didn't even think about that. But again, that concept of the war in heaven and the councils of heaven, that's not unique to Mormonism. Other people have talked about those kinds of concepts. But I like this idea of the philosophic ideology through storytelling. Dostoevsky comes to mind, Albert Camus. There's lots of people that tell stories that are really really intricate philosophical argumentation through great, well-written novels. The Book of Abraham does not happen to be super well-written or great, but I like that at its core it's kind of similar. Okay, so Joseph Smith writes in 1836, April, basically saying that the abolitionist position is calculated to lay waste the fair states of the South and let loose upon the world a community of people who might peradventure overrun our society and violate the most sacred principles of society, chastity and virtue. We have no right, he concluded, to interfere with slaves contrary to the mind and will of their masters. There you go. And it clarifies, the apologetics will absolutely clarify that in their opinion this was completely just a political statement from Joseph Smith. But again, as we talked about with Governor Dunklin leaving the saints to rot in Missouri when they found out that Zion's camp was on its way, it says that he is more interested in doing what's practicable than doing what's morally correct. And you can say whatever you want about Joseph being as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove about this coded language about abolitionism, but it sure seems like that's not something that I would want to be ascribed, that this statement about slavery being untouchable and the fabric of our economic society, that's not a position, that's not a take that I hope ever comes out of my mouth or is attributed to me. And it is to Joseph Smith. You cannot say that he did not write that. That is published. You can look at the sources, and that's not very good. I wouldn't want people to say that of me. And it goes on to say that, moreover, abolitionists were unpopular at this time among the majority of the Northerners, and Joseph was not prompted to espouse a cause pronounced devilish on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. It's really important for us to understand one of the common simplistic binary narratives of American history as it's taught in American schools is that the South is bad and they had slaves, and the North is good and they didn't like slavery, and so the Civil War was all of the good guys in the North trying to help free the slaves in the South, where all the bad guys were keeping them as slaves. The North benefited economically from the institution of slavery, and it took a really long time for abolitionist positions to become politically tenable, and so people will do whatever it takes to be politically to get in power. And we have to remember that I just think that's really sobering that the Northerners may have felt uncomfortable about the actual ins and outs of owning humans as chattel slaves, as owning humans as property, just go watch Django Unchained or 12 Days a Slave and see the lives that these humans were living in such squalid circumstances. How could you not be an abolitionist, right? Was it Martin Luther King Jr. or someone said that, we're not free until everyone on earth is emancipated. That's a position that I think is much better than the one Joseph Smith took in his little newspaper article. I think one of the things is the distance. It's easier to live with there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, but if you get far enough away from the problem, then it ceases to affect you in your daily life. A great example of this is I am currently recording this on a microphone for the audio, like a USB mic, but also I'm recording the video for YouTube on my iPhone, and my iPhone was made by factory workers in China being paid absolute dirt wages, and whose conditions in their factory are so miserable that nets are installed on the premises so that people do not fling themselves off the roof or out of the windows to end their own suffering as they make us the smartphones that are the core of our society. I literally spend like half my day on my phone. That is so bad to say. I'm so addicted to my phone. It's really quite bad. And this is a project that I think is worth doing and is something I'm grateful to have the technology to record and upload these videos for other people. And I really appreciate the feedback that I've gotten from people thus far. Thank you so much. I hope that you can continue listening and enjoying what I have to say about this great, great book. And hopefully people will remember that really, Fawn Brodie gets all the credit. I hope something I say resonates with people, but ultimately I think the book speaks for itself, and if any of you just skip all of this and only listen to the chapters, I don't blame you at all, because Fawn this is an amazing piece of literature, and I'm really glad we're here to see it. But all that being said, I mentioned China just because I don't really think about that on a daily basis, but that's the facts of it. And that's kind of the situation that they were in with slavery. Even if you're not owning slaves, if you're in the North in the early mid-1800s, you are benefiting from the economics of humans being chained and made to work against their will. And that's one of the great moral tragedies of human civilization. Whew, that's a lot. I mean, I wrote the notes about the doctrines of the pre-earth life and things like that and the racism, but we've already covered that. Also, what's interesting is that Joseph Smith taught, and this remains a core tenet of Latter-day Saint theology to this day, is that we are both today it's commonly believed that we are spiritually adopted into the house of Israel, but Joseph and many other people really believed that they weren't just like spiritual successors to the Abrahamic covenant, but that many of the people in Kirtland were literally the sons of Jacob, etc., through his lineage. If you get a patriarchal blessing in the Mormon church, you are declared a member of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And I don't know, I've heard it said as a criticism that this can be construed as being anti-Semitic, in the sense that I don't think people who are actually Jewish would really appreciate the cultural and religious appropriation that takes place in Mormonism. That's a topic that deserves an entire series of podcasts on its own, so I'm not going to really dig into that, but that's something to think about. It's very interesting. I'm not going to get more into the Book of Abraham. If you want to read more or listen to more people talk about the Book of Abraham, I highly recommend you go listen to Robert Rittner talk about it. He's one of the world's leading Egyptologists. He actually passed away, I think this year. Within the last year, he passed away from complications, I believe, due to kidney, leukemia maybe. He did a series of really good interviews, both on the Mormon Stories podcast and I think with Radio Free Mormon, or maybe Mormonism Live. I'm not quite sure. Definitely Mormon Stories, though. It's amazing to hear him a world-renowned Egyptologist just ripped the Book of Abraham to shreds. I mean, like I said at the beginning of this commentary, the Book of Abraham for some people is like, you can just stop there. It's got its own entire section in the CES letter, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. Basically, the Book of Abraham, the parts of it that are theologically salvageable, of which there are several, you kind of can't get around the racism part of it, but the parts of it that even, again, it's the same thing as the Book of Mormon. Like, apologists, I'm fine with people saying that there's value in the standard works of the Mormon Church. The problem is you just have to acknowledge that the Book of Abraham is a standard funerary documents. In ancient Egypt, which at the time of Joseph Smith, I don't even think the Rosetta Stone had even been transliterated or whatever the word is. The Rosetta Stone had not been cracked by Champollion. So people knew nothing about hieroglyphics in ancient Egyptian culture compared to what we know now. I grew up fascinated about the pyramids and, all the Egyptology books for children, the television programs and things like that. They knew none of that. And Joseph Smith... So you just have to acknowledge that the Book of Abraham is funerary documents. In ancient Egypt, it was believed in their religion that when you die, it's the responsibility of your family and your friends and the society to provide for you the resources that you'll need to survive and thrive in the afterlife. And so that included literal food offerings and water and things like that. The family would bring those to their tomb where they were buried so that they had sustenance as they were going down the river. And I'm not an Egyptologist, but this is what I remember from watching programs. And also that they had these documents, these scrolls full of papyri full of hieroglyphics placed into their sarcophagi that were filled with basically, like, if I understand correctly, it's like spells and incantations to basically ward off evil presences and give them a little bit of like a video game, kind of like a power boost, like an XP boost, so that they can get their way through the afterlife without too much trouble. And one of those documents that was common, that kind of copy pasted into, you know how people get like live, laugh, love stuff, like all those Hobby Lobby cliche furniture for your decor for your home, is not to be irreverent. I mean, do people even practice Egyptian reverence? Can I be irreverent about that? I don't know. I watch South Park, so I guess everything's irreverent to me. But yeah, the Book of Breathings, I think, is what it was. The particular scroll from which is claimed to be the Book of Abraham, written by Abraham, it's not. Written by the hand of Joseph, it's definitely not. It was not even. It was thousands of years off. In Robert Rittner talks about this. It is like not even in the same millennium as when Abraham would have walked the earth and written those documents. It is literally it's a scroll full of spells designed to give people passing into the afterlife a little bit of extra MP to take on the final boss of the afterlife. I don't have any problem with Joseph Smith bringing Old Testament rituals into the temple in Kirtland. Like, there's nothing wrong with baptism. There's some symbolic beauty, and it talks about the artistry that's involved. Ritual is a performance art, and people who are priests who learn priestcraft, what they're doing is they're learning the performance art and the rituals of their religious tradition, so that we have things and we have ritual performances that allow us to find meaning throughout and give structure to the lives that we live. Think like many people in Asia celebrate the moon, and there are lots of people around the world have different celebrations and cultural festivals to celebrate things on the calendar, and rituals and ordinances in the Christian tradition are a way for us to designate the most important aspects of our lives as a way for us to turn ourselves to God. Getting baptized, getting christened, receiving ordinations, for Mormons, going to the temple. These are important, and I think they're valuable. For people who are agnostic or atheist like myself, I highly recommend reading the book, I guess it's called Religion for Atheists by Alain de Botton. You may recognize his name from The School of Life. That's a YouTube channel that really helped me a lot when I was going through my faith transition a few years ago. He wrote a book and gave a series of lectures summarizing his writings in that book, Religion for Atheists, that give really practical suggestions for how even non-believers can appreciate the many ways in which ritual performances, such as the ones that Joseph Smith was bringing into the Kirtland Temple, can bring meaning to our lives. Excuse me. The problem that comes in and especially in modern day Mormonism is like the secrecy and the lack of informed consent. The rituals are weird. The stuff you do in the temple today, and it doesn't sound like the Masonic stuff made it into the Kirtland Temple, at least not at first. But the stuff that you do today in the temple, frankly, is quite weird. And when you combine that weirdness with a complete veil of secrecy before you go in, completely blindsided, and the injunction at the beginning that you have to make the covenant not to tell anyone about that experience, or else Satan will literally possess your body and you will forfeit your salvation. That is, I think that's all that we need to conclusively call that problematic. And I think that's all I have to say about that. So I love this idea of ritual as performance art, and I challenge people of my disposition of agnostic atheists to think about ritual in a new way. I went through an angry Richard Dawkins, like, all religion is evil, it's the root of all the problems in society. Think of all the problems that come from religion, and many of those criticisms stand and should be addressed by modern societies, but I think there's room for beauty and appreciation of all well-meaning religions, and I think there's a lot to appreciate in Mormonism as well. I think the story of the Kirtland Temple I learned about on my mission, where these people are basically having the most amazing spiritual experience many of these people had their lives. I am inclined to believe the solemn majority of the people who wrote about this experience as at their word, that they did see angels, that they did see Jesus Christ, that the priesthood keys and stuff. Like, I'm willing to take these people at their word. The difference is we have to remember that doesn't mean that Mormonism is true, because for every story of angels attending and administering to the people at the Kirtland Temple, there are stories like this of angelic visitations and expanded consciousness in every major world religion and culture. So it's fine if you want to take people at their word talking about their experience at the Kirtland Temple, but it has to also extend to people who in Orthodox Judaism have had profound spiritual experiences confirming the truth of that faith in their life, or of born-again Christians, or people who make the Hajj to Mecca to like as an important pillar of Islam. Those people, their experiences are valid too, and my experience is valid as someone who believes that all of that is BS, in the sense that like physically and metaphysically, none of that I think is like real. Just because it may be meaningful in our quest for a meaningful life, I personally reject supernatural claims, and that's valid for me too. I think I deserve as much respect for my lack of belief as anyone deserves respect for the things that are sacred to them. It's the frustrating thing about living in America as an agnostic or atheist, as a non-believer, is that it's virtually impossible for you to have a position of influence in society as a non-believer. There has never been an openly agnostic or atheist president of the United States. As far as I know, probably 95+% of all congressmen and women who have ever served in the Senate or House of Representatives have been believers, and probably 80% of them are Christians specifically. It's hard out here for the non-believers, so throw us some slack. I know that we can be cringe and edgy or whatever, but everyone deserves respect for their beliefs, so long as their beliefs do not denigrate others, right? So I love that it talks about Joseph Smith. When years before in Kirtland, when people were prophesying and speaking in tongues, Joseph shut that down immediately. But now that Joseph is everyone's leader, and he gets all the credit for the angels administering in Kirtland, well, suddenly he's okay with it. It reminds me of, there's an episode of South Park where Eric Cartman convinces everyone in town that his Yelp reviews are the only ones that are worth listening to, and that he is the only one capable of providing valuable reviews for businesses and things. Hilarious. It reminds me of that. It's only okay if Brother Joseph is doing it. My question for you, and you can let me know in the comments or just ponder on your own, is have you ever been a part of a Kirtland experience? Again, I think these experiences real, and as someone who has partaken of substances that expand consciousness, I can personally claim I get it. I have seen some stuff, man. I have seen things that are too sacred for me to reveal, but I testify to you. No, I definitely have not seen things that are too sacred. I wish I did. I'd still be a member of the church if I did, I suppose. And I suppose that's one of the reasons I left, is that I did not have any... I didn't need a Kirtland experience to stay in the church, but I certainly would have appreciated the still small voice. Have you ever had a life-changing communal experience? Have you ever been in a group of people that and experienced something that truly changed your life? Have you ever been to a vigil for victims of a natural catastrophe or an act of violence? Have you been to a rave? Have you been to a dance club? Have you been to a concert of a band that sang the song, your favorite song, and they sang it perfectly, and the sound engineer got all the levels balanced correctly, and it just really resonated through your whole body? Have you had an experience like that? I would love to hear about it. I would say the closest thing I've had to anything close to what they experienced in Kirtland is singing in a choir. I have a degree in music, and I've spent over a decade of my life singing in choirs on a weekly basis. And when you get a choir together singing a really beautiful piece of music, and everyone is in tune and everyone is blending together, that is a really spiritually healing and fulfilling experience. I can't say I've ever had like visions of sugar plums above my head as I've sang in a choir, but yeah, and I should say, I mentioned substances that expand your consciousness. I think, I'm not going to claim any sort of fact, but I believe there is a hypothesis in the origins of Mormonism that psychoactive substances may very well have played a role, not only specifically in this experience in Kirtland, but in many of the experiences of early Mormonism. So that's worth chewing on and doing some more research about, because I think that's plausible. It's a theory worth exploring, and I will say that those substances for me have contributed to. I have had more spiritual fulfillment from those experiences than anything I ever learned on my mission, and anything I ever experienced as a faithful, devout, Orthodox member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's all we got for here, and for chapter 12. This was a great chapter. I'm really looking forward to chapter 13. I hope you are as well, and have a great night. See ya.